This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 6 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. Weidenman informs me that you do not propose removing the remains. Of this I am glad, as this will enable us to sleep by him and Brewer when we shall have been gathered to our fathers. With tears in my eyes, I say to you that I think I shall sleep that long sleep easier by their side. Since these troubles commenced, I often feel that I would like to share their sleep. Letter from McSween to the late John Tunstall's father, after McSween's exoneration by the court. The McSween faction, it seems, had won a decisive victory in court. The Regulators were free since the sheriff wasn't pursuing any arrests. The atmosphere in Lincoln in mid-April 1878 was jubilant. There was even what some might call hope. But while it may have seemed like the House under Dolan and Riley had acquiesced, they were only biding their time and plotting their comeback. At the courthouse after the blows came one after another to Dolan, he had his secret meeting with District Attorney and Santa Fe ring member Reinerson. This conversation was apparently overheard by a certain Atanasio Martinez. What Martinez claimed he heard was Reinerson tell Dolan, quote, "Don't give up. Stick to that McSween crowd. I will aid you all I can, and will send you 20 men. Stick to the fight, and give it to those rascals. This is the only way to win." End quote. Both Maurice G. Fulton, who quoted that, and we both question if the conversation really ever happened. But Fulton writes of it, quote, "Whether such a conversation took place or not, the fact remains that shortly afterwards, a Rio Grande posse appeared in Lincoln County, composed of John Kinney, a very hard character from Doña Ana County, and several companions of light complexion. The arrival of the Kinney crowd augured the use of more ruthless measures than heretofore." End quote. Now, to clarify really quick, Boss Kinney the cattle rustler, he did not arrive with this posse. He would come a few months later. And that arrival was indeed bad news. At the end of the previous episode, I mentioned that Brady's deputies weren't in Lincoln at the time of the court, and that was because they were gathering men in the Pecos River Valley, which was to the southeast of the town of Lincoln. By the end of the court session, the ex-deputies had already gathered. According to author George R. Matthews in his book Billy the Kid, The Life Behind the Legend, Matthews states that the deputies had already gathered 25 to 35 Seven Rivers boys, as they would be known. And all of these Seven Rivers boys had revenge in their heart for the death of Brady. The Seven Rivers boys weren't difficult to recruit. Many of them worked at or were owners of ranches that were in direct competition or confrontation with John Chisholm, the king of the Pecos. And these Seven Rivers men knew that McSween and Chisholm were in this fight together. It also didn't hurt Matthews, the recruiter, that Frank McNabb, the cattle detective, had directly threatened to run out every single cattle thief in the county. Down at Seven Rivers, everyone was a cattle thief, and everyone stole from Chisholm's herd. Or, well, they stole from the outfit in St. Louis that McNabb worked for. As Maurice Fulton writes, quote, The Pecos men were ready to inject into the tangled situation their load of grievances against Chisholm. End quote. Over in Lincoln, the first Sunday after the court, April 14, 1878, Minister Ely's church attendance at the McSween's residence had exploded from 11 people to over 30. In attendance were the Regulators, McSween fresh out of jail, his wife, Frank McNabb the cattle detective, and most every other non-Catholic resident in the area. Ely apparently spoke on the words, quote, "What is a man profited if he gain the whole world and lose his soul?" End quote. I wonder who that was directed towards. 10 days later, April 24th, news finally reached Lincoln of the riders from the east, the so-called Seven Rivers Boys. They were on their way, and they were expected any day. On the 28th, 4 days after the news reached the town, Wideman would write to Tunstall's father, and he would say, quote, "We are expecting an attack on the town tonight and are having guards out, but I am happy to say that I think peace and quiet are slowly returning. We have succeeded in driving Dolan and his party out of town. They have been indicted by the grand jury and will, sooner or later, be brought to justice. We yet expect to have many a skirmish, but right is sure to win in the end." End quote. If only that were true. And to be clear real quick, earlier I said there were 20 men coming from the Rio Grande Valley. These Seven Rivers Boys are not those 20 men. The house was about to be reinforced from both the east and the west. That very night, on the 28th, Wideman's prediction came true. Well, partially true. The three ex-deputies, George Pepin, Billy Matthews, and John Long, were in league with the Boys and a rancher named William H. Johnson, as well as his cowboys. Johnson had previously been accused of cattle rustling by John Chisholm. Johnson had probably rustled some cattle, but the accusation alone put him in league against Chisholm and, by extension, against McSween and the Regulators. Oh, and he had at one time been a deputy of the dead Brady. But it wasn't only these men. There were around 35 in all, including some of the men who killed Tunstall, and including some names that will be important later, like John Long, Bob and Wallace Olinger, John and Robert Beckwith, Tom Cochran, Tom Green, John Hurley, and a slew of others. Morris J. Bernstein, the clerk for the crooked Agent Godfrey at the Mescalero Apache Reservation, he would write to the Cimarron News and Press, and he would call the Seven Rivers Boys the, quote, "fag ends of creation," end quote. I'm not actually sure what that means, but I can tell by the connotation that it is not a compliment. Modern interpretation of that word aside. While these banditos didn't ride into town that very night, by the next morning, they were only 8 miles east of Lincoln at a place known as Fritz Spring. Probably named after the Fritz of the life insurance check debacle, which probably started this whole thing. But as Wideman had written, the town believed they were going to be besieged by the Seven Rivers Boys the previous evening. When no attack showed up, many of the men who were guarding the town wearily rode back for their ranches and homes in the morning. Frank Coe, Ab Saunders, and Frank McNabb all headed east to their various locations that morning. The first two were headed to their ranch, and McNabb was headed to Chisholm's ranch. Along the way, though, they had to pass by this Fritz Spring. I'm sure you can see where this is headed. Frank Coe, who still had his trigger finger, was about 100 yards ahead of Saunders and McNabb when he passed by the two properties the Seven Rivers Boys had split up into and were hiding out in. The men inside the buildings, watching the three approach, let Frank Coe pass. McNabb and Saunders weren't so lucky. In Frank Coe's own words, quote, They opened up fire upon them as they reached a point about 100 yards from the house. McNabb's horse went to bucking and threw him. He ran for a mile up the canyon. The Seven Rivers men ran around the point of the hill that McNabb rounded and chased him this distance before they killed him. End quote. Saunders also had his horse shot out from under him, and he too ran. Coe would later say that Saunders, quote, ran over a little knoll and was followed up and shot through the hip, which disabled him, and he was captured. End quote. In both To Hell on a Fast Horse and History of the Lincoln County War, authors Fulton and Gardner claim McNabb was a true regulator, and they even claim that at this point, McNabb was the leader of the Regulators. I just don't see how that's true. McNabb had not ridden with the Regulators at any other point except for when he murdered McCloskey and probably Morton and Baker. It is true he said he was going to rout out every cattle thief in the country, but that was his business. He may have written a letter saying he and the Regulators were going to accomplish this, but I cannot find such a letter. Just sentences with no sources. So I don't think McNabb was the leader of the Regulators. He may have been a very vocal member of them, but leader? I feel at this point that may have been McSween. Speaking of Gardner, not to pick on him, the author Gardner, but this episode number 6 in my series, is over 9,000 words long. Gardner, in To Hell on a Fast Horse, dedicates 3 paragraphs to what I talk about in this whole episode. Only 3 paragraphs. And in those 3 paragraphs, he gets 2, but possibly 3 pieces of information wrong. Again, that's why Matthew's new book is the best, and the only one worth reading about Billy the Kid. Regardless of whether he was a regulator or not, or if he was the leader of them or not, McNabb was now dead. Another victim of the Lincoln County War. Coe, after all this went down, he took off down the road when the firing commenced. But he did not make it very far before his horse got shot in the head. Eventually, not immediately, miraculously, but eventually, the horse stumbled and threw Coe forward. Coe immediately crawled back to his horse to retrieve his rifle, but he couldn't free it from under the heavy dead horse. Coe then frantically ran for a wash where he was soon captured. Somehow, the people in Lincoln had not heard the gunfire, and they were blissfully unaware of the approaching Seven Rivers boys as they made their way into town the following morning. It was Tuesday, April 30th. They had Frank Coe as a hostage, and trailing them was the mailman with his wagon whom they forced behind them, lest he warn the town of the army of outlaws marching their way. As soon as the Seven Rivers boys got to town, they split into 2 groups, with one heading west for the Dolan house and the other staying in the east of town in the wilderness. By now, the town and the Regulators had taken notice, and according to Weidman, in a letter to Tunsel's father, quote, our party took the best stand we could and awaited their attack. End quote. The stand mentioned was a similar split in similar directions. Half the Regulators headed west towards McSween's impressively built home, while the other half went east to the home of Isaac Ellis. Not far from the Ellis home, half the Seven Rivers boys were waiting in the brush. As usual, I will let author George R. Matthews describe what happens next. He will also quote the fingerless George Coe, cousin of the captured Frank Coe. Quote, George Coe and Henry Brown stationed themselves on the roof of the Ellis house, a single-story flat-roofed adobe building with a parapet originally built for defense from Apache and Comanche raids. From the roof, Coe and Brown spotted Charlie Cruling, one of the Seven Rivers boys, downriver about 400 yards away. Coe still carried his hand in a sling from the gunshot wound inflicted by Andrew Roberts at Blazer's Mill, almost 4 weeks before. But apparently his hand had healed sufficiently for him to take action. Quote, each of us got a porthole in the roof parapet and we gave the word, and both shot. Coe remembered. "One shot fell about 200 yards short, and I knew it was Henry's. He had a little carbine." End quote. The bullet from Coe's Winchester had pierced Cruling, quote, "through the flesh of both legs. They were crossed in front of him, and cut a gash nearly 6 inches long through his hip." End all quotes. With that, this particular battle of the war in Lincoln County commenced. Over in the west part of the very small town, the firing erupted quickly after the skirmish in the east began. In the Dolan house, the Seven Rivers boys who just invaded town shot towards the north at the McSween home, where the Regulators were holed up and shooting south towards the Dolan building. In a letter to Tunstall's father, Wideman wrote that the Regulators, quote, "poured the lead into them so rapidly that in less than an hour we had them routed and had them cut off from their horses. The fighting continued throughout the day, the murderers of Frank McNabb trying to regain their horses, while we beat them back at every attempt." End quote. And I imagine the street was filled with smoke and lead and the occasional bullet as each side tried to snap the other. Eventually, the temporary sheriff, Sheriff Copeland, he got word to Fort Stanton that he needed some troops to put a stop to this pronto, lest more residents be killed in this war. Before long, 14 Black Buffalo soldiers rode into town under Lieutenant George Washington Smith. By the time he got there with his men, about 20 of the Seven Rivers boys had fled to a line of trees near the river, and another group was on a small hill nearby. Meanwhile, the Regulators were on top of and hiding behind houses. But once the Buffalo soldiers arrived, the firing ceased. After the firing stopped, an angry and irate Sheriff Copeland rode out to meet the lieutenant. After they had a brief talk, the lieutenant formed his men into a skirmish line and had their guns pointed towards the two warring factions. Lieutenant Smith then rode out between the two groups and waved his cap to signal he needed to talk. Eventually, the two groups of Seven Rivers boys came up from the creek and down from the bluff. Sheriff Copeland soon arrived, and Lieutenant Smith asked him who he wanted arrested. Copeland responded with, quote, "I want the whole damn business." End quote. 3 of the Seven Rivers boys told the lieutenant, sure, they'd surrender, but they wouldn't surrender to Copeland because they feared for their lives. They would only surrender to the Army and Lieutenant Smith. After the skirmish, it appears not a single Regulator was hit. The Seven Rivers boys? Well, I will let Matthews describe their fate. He actually reads from a number of letters. Quote, McSween later wrote to Tunstall's father that a party of 25 had attacked the town of Lincoln and lost 6 of their men. None in the town was injured. Wideman wrote the senior Tunstall that, in defending our lives, we killed 2 and wounded 4 of them. Morris Bernstein, the clerk at the Mescalero Apache Agency, reported that 6 of the Seven Rivers men were seriously, perhaps fatally, injured, and proclaimed, "This is the grandest victory yet won by the people, Mexicans and Americans, did nobly." And all quotes. So the Regulators and the people in town held their own against this quite literal invading army of outlaws. As soon as he could the following day, the gifted lawyer McSween sent out an affidavit to Justice of the Peace Juan Trujillo over in San Patricio. The affidavit was for the arrest of the Seven Rivers boys for, quote, the murder of Frank McNabb and the wounding, with the intent to kill, of Ab Saunders. End quote. Trujillo then sent the warrants over to Sheriff Copeland, who promptly headed to Fort Stanton where the men were being held. Once there, Copeland asked the once praised commander of Fort Stanton, Lieutenant Colonel Dudley. Copeland asked Dudley for an escort of soldiers so he could take the Seven Rivers murderers to San Patricio. But Dudley refused, and then countered with, "You must now arrest McSween and his men for protecting their homes in their town." It's unbelievable. Shocked but calm, Copeland responded with, "Well, I can only arrest men who have warrants." If you'll recall, the whole town praised Dudley after the court hearings that went so well for the McSween faction of Regulators. But that praise was short-sighted. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Augustus Monroe Dudley was nicknamed Gold Lace Dudley on account of the accoutrement he put all over his uniform. Gardner, Into Hell on a Fast Horse, describes him as, quote, A career Army man with not much of a career, end quote. But that isn't completely true. Dudley was from Massachusetts and he signed up for the Army in 1855. He then went on to fight in some Indian wars before the Civil War broke out. He fought in a bunch of battles in the South before he participated in the quote-unquote Reconstruction of the South. He then fought in the Northwest against more Indians before finally arriving at Fort Union a year and a half before these troubles in Lincoln. The problem with Dudley was that he was not very liked by his fellow officers. He was, according to Gardner, quote, arrogant, noisy, vindictive, a heavy drinker, and not surprisingly, generally unpopular with his fellow officers, end quote. Maurice G. Fulton describes him as, quote, he was considered an efficient officer, although he secured his results largely by fear and coercion. His manner was stern and arrogant to the nth degree. He was also highly irascible and impulsive, end quote. And again, he was a heavy drinker. Fulton writes not only did he drink a bunch, but when he did, quote, he was a very different man from the Dudley when sober, end quote. Then there's this very strange story from Fort Union, and it has him kidnap a local boy, not even a military boy, and also a local girl. The relative of the post chaplain was the girl. But he kidnaps these two kids and forces them to get married. That is for real what happened. For this, he was court-martialed, relieved of command at Fort Union, suspended from rank, and reduced to half pay for 3 months. Did he serve all of that punishment? Well, no, actually. Favorite of the podcast, William Tecumseh Sherman, restored his rank and gave him full pay, and then sent him off to Fort Stanton. Now, the court-martial could have gone a lot worse for him, but his attorney was gifted. His defense had been led by the Santa Fe law firm of Catrone and Thornton. His attorney had been Thomas Catrone himself, leader of the Santa Fe Ring. Dudley was not an impartial military leader at Fort Stanton when it came to the Lincoln County War. He was firmly on the side of the Ring and, by extension, the House. And to prove it, when Copeland and Lieutenant Smith with the Buffalo Soldiers brought the Seven Rivers Boys up to Fort Stanton the previous day, Dudley refused to allow the men to be disarmed by the sheriff. Dudley also refused to put the murderers in the guardhouse. Dudley even hinted that, as soon as Sheriff Copeland had left, he was going to let the men go. Now, when Copeland learned of this, he threatened the commander and said Copeland and Lincoln would hold Dudley personally responsible for what happened afterwards if he did such a thing. As soon as Copeland left the fort, Dudley immediately called over the unimprisoned ex-deputies Matthews and Pepin and had them swear an oath that the McSween faction and the Regulators had, quote, had made assault with intent to kill, end quote. Dudley then sent a military courier as quickly as he could ride to Blazer's Mill in South Fork, and that is the scene of the battle where Brewer was killed. Once the courier arrived, the justice of the peace in that community signed warrants for the Regulators and McSween, as well as a few others who had been hiding in their homes during the shootout in Lincoln. To the credit of the South Fork justice of the peace, as soon as he had reluctantly signed these warrants, he resigned. He wanted nothing to do with this war. It was now Thursday, May the 2nd, and on that morning, Lieutenant Millard Fillmore Goodwin. Man, so many people in this story are named after presidents. But that morning, Goodwin, with some cavalry and dragging along Sheriff Copeland, the detachment headed to Lincoln to make their arrests for Dudley and the House and the Ring. Once in town, Copeland was forced to arrest Rob Weidenman, Isaac Ellis, his son Will Ellis, John Scroggins, Ignacio Gonzalez, Sam Corbett, and Doc Skurlock. And these men were immediately sent to Fort Stanton, where they were actually placed in the guardhouse, unlike the Seven Rivers Boys who were milling about as free armed men. From Lincoln, the troopers in Copeland under Goodwin rode to San Patricio to arrest the rest of them. Down in San Patricio, Copeland hesitated to arrest McSween. Copeland didn't think it was necessary. The man and his men, the Regulators, were defending themselves from an armed invasion bent on their destruction for the corrupt ex-leaders of Lincoln, men who weren't even in town. And besides, McSween was never armed. Goodwin, though, called Copeland and said, "You've got the warrants, now make the arrests." Copeland reluctantly did so. Goodwin, frustrated that no other Regulators were around, asked McSween where William Bonney the Kid and Beaudry and Middleton were. McSween answered with, "I have not seen them." Goodwin, now angry, said, "That's a lie. Not only have you seen them, but you had just been with them and paid for their dinners at Elijah Dow's store." End quote. McSween scoffed and said, "You are grossly insulting me, sir." Everyone arrested were quite dumbfounded and confused. An armed gang of men, numbering upwards of 35, had rode into their town with intent to kill them. The town had then defended themselves. The bad men had been arrested, although not disarmed nor jailed. And then the army shows up to arrest those who defended themselves, and they were actually thrown in jail and disarmed. It's like the principal punishing the kid who fought back after a sucker punch more than the kid who threw the sucker punch. It's like... No, I have to stop there. The clerk of the Indian Agency, Bernstein, wrote later, the question I assume everyone listening is also asking themselves. He wrote, quote, "Suppose the charge against the residents of Lincoln confined in the filthy guardhouse, that of assault with intent to kill, to have been true. Was there any reason why they should be treated worse than those charged with and indicted for murder?" End quote. It's a good question. Dudley was so partisan that he actually let the ex-deputy Matthews out of the fort. He allowed him to go to Murphy's ranch and collect cattle for the fort and bring it back. The man had a double murder hanging over his head. But that did not matter to Dudley Do-Right, a man who will become ever more contemptible as this story continues. Since the Justice of the Peace over at South Fork resigned in protest, Dudley was left with the Justice of the Peace in San Patricio, which, thankfully for the Regulators and McSween, was on their side. And Dudley knew this, so he begrudgingly gave all the prisoners, both the Seven Rivers Boys and the Regulators and McSween, to Sheriff Copeland. Once they were handed over to him, Copeland promptly sent the Regulators and McSween home. He then told the Seven Rivers Boys to do the same, but also to behave themselves and to not come back to Lincoln. As a murderous posse, at least. Which is pretty lenient, if you ask me. But Copeland was essentially forced on this course of action, on account of Dudley refusing to escort the 20-odd Seven Rivers Boys to San Patricio with soldiers. There was no way Copeland could safely take them to San Patricio. And truthfully, Copeland couldn't promise the Seven Rivers Boys would arrive anywhere alive either. Although again, they were armed, and they were a rather large bunch. But Dudley Do-Right knew all of this. When the Regulators returned to Lincoln, Copeland immediately deputized Doc Scurlock to help him keep the peace. And peace did arrive. For a time. Curiously, after not many days had passed, a letter appeared by the anonymous El Gato, or the cat, in Spanish. But a letter appeared in the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican, which was the Santa Fe Ring's newspaper. That paper was their mouthpiece. But the letter from El Gato said, quote, "There is at present a lull in the tempest, and although it is not considered even probable that the war has reached an end, yet all are thankful even for a few days' respite." End quote. Author George R. Matthews and others venture to guess that El Gato is the ex-deputy Pepin of the Dolan House faction. And I believe it. And I believe it because what was printed in the rather long letter pointed to only two people who could have written it. This letter totally exonerated the Seven Rivers boys while making up a bunch of rosy lies about them. It also told slanderous lies about the sheriff, the regulators, and the dead McNabb, who El Gato said, of course, McNabb had fired first at the Seven Rivers boys hidden in the houses. El Gato said, "Oh, us Seven Rivers boys were just in town to help the sheriff arrest the regulators, but instead, the sheriff gathered the regulators up and they surprise attacked us." Which is just garbage. The regulators really were carrying on the long and storied American tradition of fighting corruption. By May 10th, trouble started again. And it was the Seven Rivers boys, yet again. They had decided to steal some horses from Tunstall. Although Tunstall was by now murdered, and technically his murder was on account of his stolen horses in the first place. It was almost like a slap in the face to McSween and the Regulators that the Seven Rivers boys chose to steal 6 horses from the late, great Tunstall. Within hours of hearing the news, Deputy Sheriff under Copeland, Doc Scurlock, he gathered up a posse of Regulators and New Mexican Hispanics, and this posse numbered around 30 men, and their plan was to get those horses back. They were headed for the joint Dolan and Riley cow camp, which they figured the horses had been at. This cow camp was located in the Pecos River Valley, all the way down near the Texas border. Now, obviously, among Scurlock's posse was no doubt William H. Bonney, soon to be Billy the Kid. Despite this series being mostly about him, there's not all that much written about him by the participants who kept the best records. So when you read a book about the young man, you've got to realize nearly every story is a myth. And that's again why I love George R. Matthews and his extremely well-cited and sourced book. The book dispels a lot of stories the other books over Billy the Kid throw out as fact. I'm pretty good at clarifying statements with apparently, according to, story has it, etc., if I ain't sure the source is spot on. A lot of books, though, just flat out say this is what happened, without any qualifiers. I like qualifiers. They cover my butt in case I got something wrong. But having footnotes and a list of sources is the surefire way to my heart for an author. So a lot of the books I read for this series plug Billy the Kid into every fracas and scrape and shootout and violent escapade that happened during the entire Lincoln County War. And that's because his myth was larger than the young man himself. Much like the Pleasant Valley War episode, this series focuses less on a single man, for now, because it will be more about Billy later. But the series is more on the troubles of Lincoln County and its history. Hence why I named this series Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War, instead of something like Billy the Kid followed by my always cleverly named subtitles. All that being said, Deputy Doc Scurlock and his 30 men rode far to the southeast to recover the horses. And no doubt, Billy the Kid rode with the other Regulators on their way to Black River. Their goal was to recover the horses. But at the cow camp, which had armed guards, the Regulators got into a shootout. And in this shootout, Manuel Segovia, aka the Indian, was shot. He was shot and killed by the posse. 2 others were wounded. After the gunfight, the Regulators scattered the cattle at the cow camp, recovered 4 of the horses, and then headed back to Lincoln. The problem with this action down at Black River was that Catrone, the head of the Santa Fe Ring, technically owned that cow camp. So the Regulators had just attacked the head of the snake. A few days later, the Regulators were at it again. Weidman, Deputy Scurlock, William H. Bonney the Kid, Middleton, Brown, and Waite, as well as 2 more men. They all rode down to Tunstall's old cow camp, where they had once holed up in anticipation of a shootout with Deputy Matthews. Weidman and the Regulators, down at Tunstall's old camp, Weidman and the Regulators rightfully feared that the Seven Rivers boys were going to start rounding up and stealing the late Tunstall's herd. The two men that tagged along have been players recently in the story. I'm not sure if I named them. Those men were Sam Smith and John Newcomb. Matthews writes of them and says, quote, Smith had been a member of Weidman's posse on the night of February 23rd, the day after Tunstall's funeral, that had searched unsuccessfully for Jesse Evans and other alleged members at the Dolan and Tunstall stores. Smith also had ridden with Dick Brewer's posse that had captured and executed Billy Morton and Frank Baker. Rio Ruidoso rancher John Newcomb had helped recover Tunstall's body and brought it in his wagon to McSween's home. End quote. They may or may not have been regulators, but these men were clearly believers in their cause and were friends of McSween's. Or at the very least, they were against the Seven Rivers Boys. I mean, everyone not of the house was against them. It's not like you win the sympathy of a population after you ride hard and armed into their town and start shooting it up. Not surprisingly, on their way to Tunstall's camp, the regulators had a small scrape with 19 of the Seven Rivers Boys. A small shootout occurred, but it doesn't seem like anyone on either side was injured. Once at the camp, the men secured the cattle and promised to watch over the herd. I'm not sure how long they planned on being cowboys at the late Tunstall Ranch, but probably until this whole entire affair got settled by the arrival of those special investigators by the Department of Justice and the Department of the Interior. Speaking of which, I opened the 4th episode with a quote from Special Investigator Frank Warner Angel from the Department of Justice. I said, quote, "The history of Lincoln County has been one of bloodshed from the days of its organization. Murder is no new thing in Lincoln County." End quote. Well, by May 4th, so a few weeks before the events I just described, Angel had arrived, and he was in Santa Fe, where he was beginning his investigation. There in the old town, he met with the governor and anyone else he needed to, and that would meet with him. Of course, the Santa Fe ring disliked Angel immensely. Angel had been in the territory 5 years prior, and he had uncovered crimes even back then. The ring called Angel self-righteous and gave him a goofy nickname in the paper. It was going to be tough for Angel in New Mexico. So I will briefly quote the author Matthews as he describes Angel and his mission. Quote, "The 33-year-old New York attorney had been given a daunting assignment. He was to investigate the September 1877 murder of a Reverend Franklin J. Tolby in Colfax County in northeastern New Mexico, to look into alleged land fraud and into corruption among federal appointees in the territory, and to investigate the murder of John Tunstall and subsequent violence in Lincoln County." End quote. Obviously, what matters to us is the corruption, land fraud, and the murder of John Tunstall. By May 15th, about the time the regulators had arrived at the cow camp, Angel had entered Lincoln, where he was greeted by an article in the Cimarron News and Press. This article had been written by Weidman, and in it he wrote, quote, "The iron heel of the ring is to be removed from the necks of our people. If monopolies are to be broken, if the blighting, despotic, and pernicious power and influence of officials in New Mexico are to be brought to an end and authoritatively exposed, the people must come to the front. Every man and woman in New Mexico, knowing the damaging facts against U.S. officials, should disclose them now to Mr. Angel. The cry from New Mexico has become so loud, strong, and consistent that the administration has sent Mr. Angel to hunt the cause. The people who are familiar with the game must now guide the hunter." End quote. Which is a pretty good letter. Over the next few weeks, Angel would take hundreds of pages of notes, tons of testimonies, and write down plenty of stories from the Lincoln County residents. Weidman wrote to Tunstall's father and told him that, "We are doing our utmost to make sure that your son finally gets justice." But the Santa Fe ring was going to make that as difficult as possible. Starting with, in early June, the corrupt Governor Axtell would make yet another proclamation in regards to Lincoln County. Because, his last ones went over so well. This would be a severely egregious proclamation, though. After Skurlock and the Regulators, with their New Mexican posse friends, after they got the stolen horses back from the Dolan-Riley cow camp, Riley and Dolan were furious, so they wrote Catrone, who again technically owned the cows that were stampeded. Catrone then seemingly told the governor that he needed to do even more down in Lincoln. From his palace of the governors in Santa Fe, Axtell unceremoniously axed Sheriff Copeland. He relieved the sympathetic to the Regulators sheriff of his duty. Axtell then placed the ex-Sheriff Brady deputy Pepin as sheriff. From his arrival in Lincoln County, Pepin had been a Murphy Dolan Riley sympathizer. He was one of them, technically. He had been a Yankee in the California column. He then helped rebuild Fort Stanton after the war on account of him being a stonemason before the war. He then built 2 houses in Roswell before he built the actual walls of the Murphy Dolan house, the building at the west end of town. He built the house. Pepin was also at this time a deputy U.S. Marshal. I hope this series is painting a more sympathetic light on the Regulators than other books and movies and sources do. That is my aim. I am presenting evidence with only a little bias, but the things these men of the ring and the house get away with is incredible. But remember, Regulators strike blows in defense of justice. It's just that justice, it seems, was incredibly hard to come by in Lincoln County, New Mexico in the 1870s. Weidman wrote to Tunstall's father about all of this and perfectly sums up my objections as well. He wrote, quote, "Affairs have somewhat changed here. Our objections to this are, first, that under the laws of this territory the governor has neither the power nor the right to do this. Second, that this Pepin is one of the murderers of McNabb. Third, that he is one of a band of thieves and murderers. Fourth, that he is a highwayman, and at present time one of a party of men who are waylaying the roads for the purpose of killing me and others. This act of the governor's shows him and the other officials of this territory in their true light, and it is difficult to see what the result may be. I think, though, that if we give them enough rope, they will hang themselves." Mr. Angel, who was investigating the conduct of officials in this territory, seemed rather disgusted with their proceedings when I last saw him. May he prove an angel to us not only in name, but in deed. End quote. Unfortunately, with Copeland out as sheriff, Skurlock and all his Regulator deputies lost their badge. The Regulators were yet again outside the law. To no one's surprise, Pepin immediately swore in his outlaw Seven Rivers boys as deputies, including John Long and a man named Buck Powell, as well as a few others. Middleton, who knew Powell, would write him a letter that essentially said, "We, the Regulators, don't see your authority as legitimate, and we challenge you and your men to assert any legal authority over us." He pretty much said, "Come get us." He actually wrote, quote, "Do you think that 6 of us would run from the posse you have? We would like to see them too well. Come, and you can find us." End quote. Those 6 men Middleton mentioned were the core of the Regulators. They were Middleton, Doc Skurlock, Charlie Beaudry, Henry Brown, Fred Waite, and by now, 18-year-old Billy Bonney, soon to be Billy the Kid. But as usual, the deck was stacked against the Regulators. At the same time that Axtell had relieved Copeland, he also, in a surprising and illegal move, he wrote to the head of the military department of New Mexico. This was a certain Colonel Hatch, and he asked for troops to be sent down to the Roswell area to protect Catrone's cattle. He claimed the Regulators had just recently stolen cows and run off the herd. While that's partially true, they did scatter the herd and got in a shootout and killed a man, but they were recovering Tunstall's stolen horses, which were hid there by the outlaws of the Seven Rivers boys. That part was left out of Axtell's letter to Colonel Hatch. Not surprisingly, Colonel Hatch agreed and ordered the ex-commander of Fort Stanton, Captain Purrington, with some troopers, to the Pecos River Valley. Days later, someone going by the alias Pecos, probably John Chisholm, he wrote a letter to the Cimarron News and Press. It was a long and sarcastic letter, as John Chisholm liked to do. And in the letter, he criticized the decision by the Army and predicted that it did not bode well for the people of Lincoln County. He ended the sarcastic letter with, quote, "We expect to have lively times here this summer," end quote. And those lively times would arrive with the aforementioned king of cattle rustling, Boss Kinney, and 20 of his men. They were all fresh from a fracas down in El Paso, where they'd been shooting, scraping, and looting the town in the wake of some civil unrest there. They didn't just arrive to Lincoln of their own accord, though. Oh no. Sheriff Pepin actually summoned them there. He even wrote a memorandum about it. He wrote, quote, "I have summoned John Kinney as one of my posse to assist in quelling the riots in Lincoln County," end quote. I do not know what riots he's talking about. So to summarize the state of things, murderer and once deputy to the corrupt dead Sheriff Brady was now sheriff. The Army was illegally stationed in the Pecos River Valley under Purrington, the corrupt ex-head of Fort Stanton. The Army under Dudley, at Fort Stanton, were in with the ring in the house, and the Seven Rivers Boys and now John Kinney and 20 of his men were essentially deputized in Lincoln. The Regulators had no lawful authority. They were very outnumbered, outgunned. Affairs have somewhat changed here indeed. Weidman was so very right. In mid-June, another investigator, this one from the Department of the Interior, arrived to the Mescalero Indian Agency. This inspector, a Mr. Watkins, immediately found out that the corrupt Indian agent Godfrey, who stayed over at the Blazers Mill in South Fork, where Dick Brewer had been killed, well, Inspector Watkins discovered that Godfrey had essentially stolen from the Mescaleros and delivered the food instead to the Dolan Riley house. There was indisputable evidence of this. Not to mention, the Apaches had only received 400 out of the promised 1,150 beefs, because the rest had been handed over to the house and 2 other house-adjacent men in the county. So Inspector Watkins discovered this, and instead of reporting these truths, the inspector fabricated entire false histories and stories and covered for the house while implicating not only McSween, but also, curiously, Reverend Ely. It makes no sense. Maybe he was bribed. I do not know why he did this. Definitely he was bribed. There's more to this, and it's important to set up what's coming next. But I will let Matthews tell the story. Quote, "Lieutenant Colonel Dudley had told Watkins that McSween was a dangerous, unreliable man whose reputation was very bad and who could not be believed under oath where his own interests were concerned. When Watkins asked Jesse Evans, still under arrest at Fort Stanton and nursing his bullet-shattered right elbow, if McSween had aided his escape from the Lincoln Pit Jail in November 1877, Evans replied, 'Yes, Mr. McSween and party helped us out. I and the boys with me rode his horses from his ranch with his consent. He told us to take his horses and anything else he had. We took his horses, saddles and bridles, also arms. We returned the horses, but did not return the arms.' McSween, of course, was an attorney. He did not have a ranch. Evans also charged that he and others had been hired by John Chisholm to steal horses from the Mescalero Apache Reservation, Chisholm providing the horses and arms to do so. Asked by Watkins if he believed McSween was involved with Chisholm's horse stealing, Evans answered, 'Yes, sir, I do. He was acting as agent for Mr. Chisholm since 1873. In fact, McSween had only arrived in Lincoln in March 1875. Evans continued, 'I have heard him, McSween, talk with the men who were engaged in stealing horses and in such a way as to connect him with Mr. Chisholm. I have known of Mr. McSween's buying stolen horses and paying for them. I do not know whether for himself or as agent for Mr. Chisholm. Mr. McSween has made me offers to engage in stealing horses the same as Mr. Chisholm did.' Inspector Watkins, supposedly conducting an impartial investigation, added this postscript to Evans' imaginative testimony. The above statement was made by Jesse Evans, a notorious horse thief, while under the charge of the U.S. Marshal and suffering from a wound received while attempting to rob a sheepherder's camp. Although a horse thief, he has a reputation for telling the truth. Then, without ever speaking with McSween, Watkins declared the Lincoln attorney to be the head and moving spirit of a banditti, the Regulators. End all quotes. I mean, that is absolutely incredible. How much stuff Jesse Evans lied about. It's kind of insane. And this inspector, it's incredible. The House always wins. On June 18th, a Tuesday, Sheriff Pepin requested troops from Dudley, and of course Dudley immediately granted them. Illegally. Pepin was wanting to make arrests, but he was going to need, I guess, even more help. Dudley sent 27 soldiers under 2 officers to Lincoln. Those officers were Millard Fillmore Goodwin and Sam Pegg. Halfway between the fort and the town, Pepin and Boss Kinney, as well as all of their men, met up with Goodwin and his soldiers, but things got off to a rocky start. Goodwin immediately recognized Boss Rustler Kinney, and he refused to ride with him. Remember when I told y'all the story about how after Kinney and Evans and a few others lost a fistfight with soldiers over near Las Cruces, and then they opened fire on the troops during a dance and killed a whole bunch of innocent people? The soldiers had not forgotten about those murders, nor had they forgotten that Kinney had never served any time for them. So Kinney and his men had to get lost, but that didn't stop Pepin, who rode into town with his men and the troops. By now it was dark, but they went on to commence to search for their targets, the 4 main Regulators: Middleton, Brown, Waite, and William H. Bonney the Kid. But at this point, Jim French's leg would have healed, and he was most likely with these 4. If you recall, he was one of the men who killed Brady and Heineman in the street, but luckily for him, there was no arrest warrant for him. That wouldn't stop Pepin, though, who knew very well that French had been among those who killed the corrupt sheriff. Of course, the 4 Regulators were nowhere to be found in town. They probably got word and had long ago left. Most likely, even before Boss Kinney and his men showed up, they were gone. And they'd be joined by more Lincoln residents and Regulators soon enough. Especially after Catrone, the head of the Santa Fe ring, got arrest warrants for Charlie Beaudry, Doc Scurlock, Henry Brown, Henry Antrim alias Kid, John Middleton, Stephen Stevens, John Scroggins, George Coe, and Frederick Waite. These warrants were for the killing of Catrone and the House's man, Roberts, during the infamous Blazers Mill that saw Brewer killed. And Roberts killed as well. By June 24th, Weidman and McSween had also snuck out of town. A town that was now overrun with dangerous outlaws and murderers hell-bent on getting revenge for Brady's murder, and absolutely doing the bidding of the Santa Fe ring. Most everyone just mentioned, a lot of the Regulators, including Billy the Kid, and also Weidman and McSween, were all hiding out at Chisholm's fortified Presidio Ranch. But not everyone had gotten the heck out of Dodge. A day later, on the 25th of June, cousins George, missing his trigger finger, and Frank Coe also left Lincoln, and they were heading to the ranch on the Pecos River to meet up with their fellow men. Before they made it too far, though, they only made it to San Patricio, but when they got to that small town, they were fired upon. Frank Coe would later describe the brief skirmish. He'd say, way later in 1927, quote, "They fired 15 or 20 shots at us, but they got just one good shot before we got around the point. We whirled our horses and ran back up the river and started across it to make a stand in Gutierrez Canyon, almost opposite San Patricio. But we hit a deep hole in the river and our horses went under. We ran on up the river to make a stand and the other bunch backed off. They thought our whole party of Regulators was there. John Kinney, a noted bully from the Rio Grande, led them. Many of his party were Texas outlaws." End quote. So the Coe cousins escaped. But this little fracas convinced Sheriff Pepin that the Regulators were hiding out in San Patricio. But again, they were actually down at Chisholm's Ranch on the Pecos. So on the following day, the 26th, Pepin sent Deputy Long and 5 other men down to San Patricio to arrest whomever he could. Of course, none of the regulators were there, except for one of the men who had worked for McSween. But he was not a regulator. He was one of the black men who had been released from territorial service after being arrested twice. Still not sure what territorial service means, but he was cleared of any murder charges. But that did not matter. Long arrested the man again. That makes 3 times for this poor man. What comes next is ridiculous. But Long lies and says after he captured the Negro, he got into a huge shootout with the regulators, including McSween and Billy the Kid. He actually said McSween shot at him with intent to kill. But remember, McSween doesn't carry a weapon. The entire story was invented. He made it up. It was fiction. That did not matter. An affidavit was written up for yet another arrest warrant for McSween and Billy the Kid for attempted murder. It did not bother Pepin one bit that the event never happened. On account of this made-up firefight, Sheriff Pepin sent word to Dudley that he needed troops yet again. Dudley, of course, obediently sent them. They were under the command of Captain Henry Carroll. These soldiers and Pepin, along with his deputies and whomever else his posse consisted of, they spent the next 4 days wandering Lincoln County, searching high and low for the regulators. Later, Captain Carroll, would write of the search that it was the most, quote, toilsome and disagreeable march, the most disagreeable duty that can be assigned to either officer or soldier, end quote. Luckily for the captain, though, word reached the man that what he was doing had been deemed illegal on June 18th of that very year, when Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act. This act pretty much outlawed what Dudley and the Santa Fe Ring had been doing in Lincoln for quite some time now. The military was no longer allowed to participate in civil affairs unless personally authorized by the President of the United States. So there could be no more troops or troopers pouring into Lincoln under Dudley Do-Right. Right? I mean, that's what that means, right? Certainly, there won't be any more egregious military action from Fort Stanton and Lincoln. And that would be illegal. Certainly no one's going to drag cannons into the street and a Gatling gun, right? Illegality has not stopped the House, the Ring, or Dudley before. This act of Congress won't neither. This bill is usually quoted as being the official end of Reconstruction in the South, aka the complete subjugation of white Southerners following the Civil War, which subjugation set back the South even further than the war already had. But I won't be going into that. Despite the lack of military escorts, Sheriff Pepin continued his search after a few days' rest. This time, Boss Kenny and his men rode with the sheriff and the Seven Rivers Boys. Also accompanying them was Dolan, who had by now returned from Santa Fe. He clearly felt safe enough that no one would collect the $5,000 reward McSween and Tunstall's father had put up for his arrest. By July 3rd, they were all in San Patricio, where yet again the outlaw-filled posse found no regulators. Furious at their lack of success thus far, and aided by Kenny and his thugs and their violence and lawlessness, the whole posse ransacked the town. According to an anonymous letter written by the pseudonym Lincoln, the posse, quote, killed and stole horses in San Patricio last week. They broke windows and doors, smashed boxes, and robbed them of their contents. From an old woman who was living alone, they stole $438. They tore the roof off a Dow Bros store, threw the goods out on the street, and took what they wanted. Towards women, they used the vilest language. Citizens working in the fields were fired upon, but made good their escape up the river. End quote. Unlike the story that Long, or rather Dolan, had made up about the fake shootout at San Patricio, this story was actually true. Down to the letter, pretty much. Which is not surprising given the participants. The women of San Patricio wrote to Dudley and asked for soldiers to protect them against Sheriff Pepin's posse and any further action. But Dudley's hands were tied. Oh no, I'm sure he thought. But he did in fact send an officer down there to assess the damage and see if the report was true. This officer, Captain Thomas Blair, rode down with Juan Patron, and the two looked over the veracity of the letter. Sure enough, it had been true. Blair wrote, quote, "From what I saw and heard, it appears that the sheriff's posse, acting to some extent, exactly how far does not appear, under Mr. Dolan's instructions, tore down a portion of a house, forced and tore open a number of doors, and searched houses without showing or claiming to have any legal warrants for doing so. That the searches were conducted in a discourteous, uncivil, and even rude manner." End quote. Once news of this raid reached the regulators over at Chisholm's Ranch, one of them, probably Middleton, wrote a letter to a man named Edgar Walls. When Dolan and Riley had to turn everything over to the Santa Fe Ring and Catrone, head of the ring, sent his brother-in-law down to Lincoln to run the Dolan store and Catrone's new herd. The letter that Middleton wrote stated, quote, "Mr. Walls, sir, we all are aware that your brother-in-law, T.B. Catrone, sustains the Murphy-Kinney party, and take this method of informing you that if any property belonging to the residents of this county is stolen or destroyed, Mr. Catrone's property will be dealt with as nearly as can be in the way which the party he sustains deals with the property stolen or destroyed by them." End quote. So a tit for tat, eye for an eye. The letter continued, though, and it said that if any of Tunstall's cows are stolen, quote, "a similar number will be taken from your brother-in-law. It is our object and efforts to protect property, but the man who plans destruction shall have destruction measured him. Steal from the poorest or richest American or Mexican, and the full measure of the injury you do shall be visited upon the property of Mr. Catrone. This murderous band, Kinney's gang, is harbored by you as your guest, and with the consent of Catrone occupies your property." End quote. The letter was simply signed, and I love this, Regulator. All the regulators, including the Coe cousins and McSween, they were all at Chisholm's Ranch on the Pecos for July the 4th. I reckon they were planning a little party up at the ranch, and they needed a few more goods, as so often happens when preparing for a party. So Henry Brown, George Coe, William Bonney the Kid, and one or two more men, they rode down to Roswell to the local store. But once they arrived, fireworks erupted, metaphorically. Coe recalled much later that, quote, "On the morning of the 4th, the Kid, Henry Brown, and I, and another one or two, went over to buy some few little articles at the store. While there, we saw a big outfit of men, Seven Rivers boys, riding up from the west, probably from the Sacramento Mountains. They had hardly got in shooting distance when we jumped on our horses and pulled for South Spring River, Chisholm's Ranch. We had the advantage as we had fresh horses, and they had tired ones. We fought a running fight for 5 miles all the way to the ranch. There were about 25 of them and only 4 or 5 of us. They never got close enough to hit us." End quote. It was a close call, though. The regulators made it all the way back to Chisholm's Ranch, where everyone was already in place, since they'd heard the shots and likely saw the dust rising from the north. I mentioned it before, but Chisholm's Ranch had been built by a Spaniard, or maybe a New Mexican. I can't remember. But it was built by a man who had defense in mind. Defense against the Comanche and the Apache, probably also the Kiowa. Any Injun who wanted to do him harm, essentially. The ranch was basically a presidio with thick walls and a flat roof with holes in the small wall to fire from. Seeing this, the posse of Seven Rivers boys, led by Buck Powell and Marion Turner, They made sure to stay clear out of the range of fire, and they'd stay there all night before retreating back to Lincoln. Over the next few days, the Coe Ranch was raided by the Dolan gang, but again the Coes were at Chisholm's ranch. Kinney and Dolan and Sheriff Pepin continued to search all over the entire Sacramento Mountains, except for the reservation, for the Regulators. And they were unsuccessful because, again, they were all at Chisholm's ranch. But the posse was growing impatient and angry. They wanted a fight. They were itching for one. A member of the posse wrote his sister and said, quote, "They have recruited to 25, McSween with them in person. Our party, or sheriff's posse, numbers about 35 men. The mob are too cowardly to come to us and fight. We have to look for them like Injuns." End quote. Over at Chisholm's ranch, the leader of the Regulators, McSween, could sense that they couldn't hide out at Chisholm's forever. McSween was beginning to see that their only option at this point was indeed to fight. And a fight was coming. It would be known in all the history books as the 5-Day War, or the Battle of Lincoln. But sometimes the fight coming is known as the Big Kill. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, the tracked a killer lion, lost his fear of man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, was gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters so could chase and fall. Now the lever-action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries, a death song for a master, killed a mighty lion. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.